There are moments in history when silence is more terrifying than war itself. When the German army marched into Paris on June 14, 1940, it was not greeted by gunfire or resistance, but by a haunting stillness that settled over the city like a shroud. The capital of France, long a symbol of art, liberty, and revolution, had surrendered not with a bang, but with a whisper. For those watching from behind lace curtains and shuttered windows, the scene was surreal. The tricolor had vanished from public buildings. Swastikas now fluttered in the breeze above landmarks of culture and democracy. A foreign language filled the air. Yet what remained most vivid in the minds of Parisians that day was not the sight of soldiers or the roar of tanks. It was the crushing weight of humiliation and the eerie quiet that replaced the rhythm of ordinary life. Fear settled into every corner, from cramped apartments to open boulevards. Children were hushed, radios were turned down low, and daily routines were stripped away. What began that day was not just military occupation, but psychological domination. The city's soul was frozen, as if time itself had stopped. With the arrival of the Nazis came a new, suffocating order. Civilians awoke to a world where former freedoms had become punishable offenses. Curfews were imposed, sometimes beginning before the sun had even set. Conversations in public became coded, guarded, or avoided altogether. Familiar spaces, the cafes, the libraries, the shops, were frequently taken over by Nazi soldiers or handed to collaborators. Markets grew thin as supplies were redirected or rationed, and luxuries quickly vanished. For Jews, the elderly, the disabled, resistance sympathizers, and anyone with an unapproved identity, the threat was no longer political, it was existential. The Gestapo worked relentlessly, sifting through records, neighbors' whispers, and anonymous tips. Every knock on a door could be a death sentence. Paris, once the city of light, had become a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. But where oppression takes root, so does desperation. Rumors began to circulate in hushed tones about escape networks, clandestine routes out of the city, out of the country, out of danger. These whispers were often the only hope people had. Among these stories, one name began to surface more frequently than others: Dr. Marcel Petiot. He was known to be a physician operating discreetly within the city, supposedly helping people secure their passage to South America or elsewhere, far from Nazi hands. Petiot's services, of course, came at a price, a steep one. But for those with the means, he seemed like a lifeline. He reportedly offered medical treatments, falsified documents and inoculations required for international travel. Families sold heirlooms, drained their savings, and staked everything they had on the belief that he could deliver them to freedom. What they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was the grim truth hiding behind that doctor's warm smile and professional demeanor. There was no route to South America, no rescue mission, no network. There was only Petiot, alone, orchestrating his own grotesque scheme under the guise of compassion. To the people he preyed upon, he appeared as a beacon of hope amid despair. But as Paris choked under the weight of occupation and its citizens lived in a daily fog of fear, Petiot quietly began building his empire of murder. He didn't wear a uniform, carry a rifle, or stand at a checkpoint. He wore a stethoscope and spoke with calm assurance. And as families disappeared without a trace, one by one, the city remained silent. In war, monsters can hide in plain sight. And in occupied Paris, Dr. Marcel Petiot hid in the one place no one thought to look, behind the facade of a man who claimed he wanted to help. In times of despair, people will place their trust in anything that offers the slightest chance of escape. By 1942, the fear in Paris had intensified. Deportations had begun. Trains were leaving for destinations that no one returned from. Jewish families were vanishing from their homes in the dead of night. Resistance fighters who once distributed pamphlets now moved in silence, hunted like animals. The Gestapo had eyes and ears everywhere, and collaboration was rampant. Those who could flee did so. Those who couldn't began looking for any lifeline, even one that seemed too good to be true. It was in this environment of desperation that Dr. Marcel Petiot's name rose quietly but quickly. His pitch was simple yet powerful. He could get you out. He had connections with the French resistance. He knew secret routes. He had doctors, ships, contacts abroad. He even had the medical authority to provide the vaccinations and documents needed to pass through checkpoints and board transport. He wasn't advertising in newspapers or public squares. He didn't have to. His reputation spread like smoke. Through whispers, referrals, and fearful conversations behind locked doors, Petiot asked for a steep fee, 25,000 francs per person. The price varied depending on circumstances, but the promise was always the same. Pay the fee, receive medical treatment to prepare you for travel, and wait for your transport. It sounded legitimate, especially when spoken by a man wearing a white coat, seated behind a desk stacked with paperwork, prescription pads, and official-looking stamps. Families who feared they had weeks or even days left clung to the idea that this doctor could deliver them from the noose tightening around their lives. Most didn't question his credentials. Many didn't even hesitate. When you are drowning, you don't check the rope being thrown. You just grab it. At first glance, Petiot seemed entirely trustworthy. His demeanor was composed. He gave his clients hope with carefully chosen words, medical language, and a soft-spoken confidence that made people feel seen and protected. Some said he had a reassuring presence. Others described him as polite, even charismatic. He would meet his clients at his townhouse on 21 Rue Le Sueur, a quiet address in an upscale part of Paris. The house didn't draw attention. It blended into the neighborhood like any other physician's office. But inside, it was a different world. Once payments were made, Petiot would administer what he claimed were vaccinations or disease prevention treatments to ensure clients could cross international borders. He told them these shots were a necessary part of travel during wartime. What they received, however, was not a vaccine. It was cyanide, delivered with a calm voice and a steady hand. Almost none of Petiot's victims suspected anything until it was too late. Their lives ended not with violence or chaos, but in a quiet room, at the hands of a man they believed would save them. Their belongings, jewelry, cash, identification, even family photographs, were confiscated before or shortly after death. Once his victims lay still, Petiot's true work began. He disposed of the bodies using methods that would evolve over time. At first, he dumped them in the River Seine. Later, he used quicklime and fire. But in these early stages, he focused on two things: killing quickly and maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. As more and more people disappeared after visiting his home, suspicions began to stir. Yet wartime Paris was a chaotic place where people vanished every day. It was easier to blame the Nazis, the resistance, or the general turmoil of the era than to believe a respected physician was systematically murdering the very people who trusted him. And so the myth of Dr. Petiot, the helper, the smuggler, the rescuer, endured, while the truth remained buried beneath the floorboards of 21 Rue Le Sueur. By early 1944, Marcel Petiot had refined his process of deception and murder. Dozens had walked into his home at 21 Rue Le Sueur, clinging to the belief that salvation lay just beyond its doors. None had ever walked out. Yet still, the illusion held. The war had made disappearances commonplace. People left under cover of night were seized by authorities, or simply never returned from their errands. Families were often too afraid to ask questions. Some feared they might implicate themselves. Others clung to the hope that their loved ones had made it to safety. The address where these desperate people vanished remained a respectable Parisian residence, or so it seemed until March 1944, when the truth quite literally rose into the sky. For several days, a foul, putrid smell had begun to settle over the neighborhood surrounding 21 Rue Le Sueur. At first, residents assumed it was just a trash fire or perhaps rotting refuse from a nearby building. But the odor only grew stronger, and with it came an increasingly visible plume of thick, acrid smoke. Complaints were made to local officials, but amid the chaos of occupation, few things took priority unless they directly affected the German authorities. It wasn't until March 11th that emergency services were finally dispatched. The fire brigade arrived and forced entry into the building through the second floor. What they found was a scene out of a nightmare. The air inside the home was dense with choking smoke. As firemen made their way down into the basement, they discovered a coal-burning stove that had been overloaded and left to run unattended. The fire within it was no ordinary household blaze. It was being used to destroy something far more sinister. Around the stove, and scattered throughout the basement, were human remains. Burned bones, charred tissue, and unmistakable fragments of human bodies littered the room. The stench that had so disturbed the neighborhood was the smell of burning flesh. Authorities were immediately notified, and investigators swarmed the home. Though Petiot was not present, it didn't take long to confirm that the house belonged to him. Police found themselves in possession of a horror house disguised as a doctor's office. The walls of the basement bore evidence of systematic dismemberment. The stove was packed with what would later be confirmed as human remains. In the courtyard, they unearthed a lime pit, dug to dissolve flesh and hide the dead. In various containers around the home were sacks filled with bones and flesh. Quicklime had been used in some cases to speed decomposition. In others, bodies had simply been left to rot. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a soundproof, windowless chamber hidden in the basement. It had been constructed like a cell, with shackles mounted to the wall and a peephole built into the door. There was no mistaking what this room was for. Not all of Petiot's victims had been killed instantly. Some had been kept alive, imprisoned, possibly tortured before their deaths. This was no longer speculation. It was now undeniable. Marcel Petiot, the trusted physician and supposed member of the resistance, had been systematically murdering people inside his own home. What began as a complaint about smoke had become one of the most gruesome crime scenes in modern French history. Police were stunned, but not entirely surprised. Whispers about Petiot had existed for some time, but no one had imagined this scale of horror. The initial estimate suggested that at least 10 people had been killed and burned in the basement. That number would rise dramatically in the days and weeks ahead. But the most pressing issue now was simple and chilling. Where was Dr. Marcel Petiot? Long before the smoke poured from 21 Rue Le Sueur, before the war, the Gestapo, or even his white coat, Marcel Petiot had already shown signs that something inside him was profoundly broken. Born on January 17, 1897, in the town of Auxerre in northern France, he was the youngest son of a civil servant and grew up in a relatively stable, middle-class household. But those who knew him as a child didn't remember a boy who was troubled by circumstances. They remembered a boy who was troubling by nature. From an early age, Petiot displayed behaviors that disturbed both his classmates and teachers. He was a compulsive thief, known to steal from other students' satchels and personal lockers, and his petty crimes were often paired with bursts of erratic and sometimes violent behavior. He regularly provoked fights and seemed to take pleasure in the fear he stirred in others. Teachers initially tried to discipline him with the usual methods, but nothing worked. Detentions, suspensions, and parental interventions made no difference. Eventually, educators and psychologists began to suspect that something more serious was at play. By his teenage years, Petiot had been expelled from multiple schools for inappropriate conduct, including at least one incident involving the sexual harassment of a female classmate. It became clear that this wasn't just a rebellious youth. There was something far more sinister developing. When he was just 17, Petiot found himself in front of a judge for the first time after being arrested for attempting to steal a public mailbox. Given his age and record of disturbing behavior, his defense lawyer pursued a strategy that would become all too familiar in Petiot's life. They argued mental illness. A court-ordered psychiatric evaluation described him as suffering from kleptomania, obsessive behavior, paranoia, and depression. The report even mentioned hereditary psychological defects and concluded that Petiot was, to a large extent, not responsible for his actions. The charges were dropped, and instead of prison, he was sent to a specialized institution to finish his education under psychiatric care. But whatever treatment he received seemed to do little to curb his impulses. By the time World War I broke out, Petiot was still a disturbed young man with a growing resume of antisocial behavior. In 1916, at the age of 19, Petiot was drafted into the French army. Military service, rather than disciplining or grounding him, had the opposite effect. The brutality of the trenches and the psychological toll of war only deepened the cracks in his already fragile mind. Petiot experienced repeated nervous breakdowns and was frequently removed from frontline duty due to what military doctors called mental disequilibrium and melancholic tendencies. He complained of headaches, insomnia, and hallucinations. After being wounded by shrapnel and exposed to chemical gas during the Second Battle of the Aisne in 1917, he was sent to recover in a military hospital. Even then, surrounded by wounded soldiers and overworked staff, Petiot could not resist his impulses. He stole morphine, army supplies, medical instruments, and even personal items from fellow patients and staff. His kleptomania had evolved into calculated theft for personal gain. Repeated incidents of theft and erratic behavior eventually landed him in a psychiatric facility, where doctors again diagnosed him with a host of disorders: amnesia, depression, phobias, and self-harming tendencies. After one final episode in which he shot himself in the foot to escape frontline duty, Petiot was discharged from military service with a 100% disability pension. It was suggested that he be committed permanently. Instead, he walked free, officially recognized as mentally unfit for duty, yet legally unburdened by his crimes. This pattern of manipulation, madness, and escape from accountability had already begun. The world would not understand the cost of that oversight until it was far too late. Marcel Petiot's descent into depravity was not solely forged in the chaos of war, but it was undeniably accelerated by it. After years of disturbing behavior, throughout his youth, the First World War provided the perfect storm for his unstable psyche. When he was conscripted into the French army in 1916, France was already deeply entrenched in a brutal, grinding conflict. For a young man like Petiot, the war was not a calling, it was a pressure cooker. He was sent to the front lines, where artillery barrages shattered nerves and gas attacks dissolved lungs. For most, the trenches were a crucible of trauma. For Petiot, they were a playground of manipulation, theft, and self-destruction masquerading as service. From his earliest days at the front, Petiot displayed signs of deep psychological instability. He suffered repeated mental breakdowns, often needing to be rotated away from the line under the pretense of rest and recovery. Doctors noted his erratic behavior. He wept, he raved, he refused orders. And yet, manpower was in such short supply that even men with obvious psychological wounds were thrown back into combat. Petiot returned to the front multiple times, each stint pushing him further into the abyss. His fellow soldiers didn't see him as a comrade, they saw him as a liability. He was unpredictable, self-serving, and fundamentally dangerous. But the war machine churned on, and Petiot was carried along with it. During the Second Battle of the Aisne in 1917, Petiot's fragile facade finally shattered. He was wounded by grenade shrapnel and exposed to weaponized gas. Though his injuries were serious, what followed was more alarming than the physical trauma. While recovering in a military hospital, Petiot immediately resumed his kleptomaniac tendencies. He stole everything he could get his hands on: morphine from supply cabinets, personal letters from other soldiers, and even medical tools. These were not random acts of madness. They were targeted, opportunistic thefts. He sold the stolen morphine to anyone willing to pay, even if it meant denying pain relief to the very men he lay beside. Hospital staff were often horrified by his complete lack of empathy. When caught stealing from a fellow soldier recovering from surgery, Petiot shrugged it off. He didn't care who he hurt, as long as he benefited. One doctor noted that he seemed to relish the disorder of the war zone. It gave him cover, it gave him excuses, and most importantly, it gave him freedom. Eventually, the frequency and severity of his thefts and bizarre behavior prompted his arrest. He was jailed at Orléans and then transferred to a psychiatric ward at Fleury-les-Aubrais. There, doctors compiled another extensive psychological profile. Petiot, they concluded, was suffering from neurasthenia, chronic depression, kleptomania, phobias, and violent obsessions. Their verdict: not guilty by reason of insanity. Despite this damning diagnosis, Petiot was not committed to an asylum. He was instead returned, astonishingly, to military service in June 1918. Within weeks, he had a final breakdown and deliberately shot himself in the foot, rendering him unfit for further combat. This final act of self-mutilation achieved what none of the system's red flags had: it got him out. In the closing months of the war, he was discharged with a 40% disability pension, which was later upgraded to 100%. He had played the system brilliantly, using madness as both shield and sword. Yet for all the diagnoses, the medications, and the temporary removals from service, nothing had truly changed. Petiot remained a manipulative, dangerous man. War had not created his madness. It had simply legitimized it. The lines between soldier, criminal, and lunatic had blurred so completely that no one truly knew what to make of him. What they failed to see, however, was that Petiot wasn't merely unstable. He was calculating. And as he returned to civilian life armed with a doctor's pension and a war hero's mask, he was now more dangerous than ever before. When Marcel Petiot returned to civilian life after the war, he did not disappear into obscurity as many broken soldiers did. Instead, he reinvented himself, or rather, he constructed a new identity from the fragments of his fractured past. Benefiting from a program designed to help war veterans re-enter the workforce, Petiot enrolled in an accelerated education course. In less than a year, he managed to become a licensed physician. That he had no formal medical training before the war, nor any proper psychiatric clearance, was irrelevant in post-war France where systems were overburdened and records loosely kept. It was a disturbing irony. A man deemed too mentally unstable to serve was now certified to care for the sick and vulnerable. In 1921, Petiot moved to the quiet town of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where he opened a private medical practice. He quickly gained a reputation for being charismatic, attentive, and unusually generous with medications. Patients appreciated his soft-spoken demeanor and the speed with which he wrote prescriptions. But behind the doctor's charm was a predatory instinct. Petiot exploited his patients, especially the poor and elderly, by enrolling them in state-funded health assistance programs without their knowledge and billing the government for treatments he never performed. He also developed a habit of overprescribing addictive narcotics, morphine, heroin, and opium, to patients who would become dependent and return regularly, both for their fix and his silent extortion. In public, Petiot played the role of a civic-minded doctor. He was admired for making house calls and for his generosity toward the infirm. Yet his darker side became harder to conceal. He began performing illegal abortions in secret. He continued stealing, not just from patients, but from neighbors, friends, and even family members. His brother Maurice would later confess to always checking his pockets after visiting Marcel, just in case something had gone missing. The thefts were not about survival. They were about compulsion and power. Petiot took what he wanted because he knew he was clever enough to get away with it. Then, in 1926, something far more sinister occurred. A young woman named Louise Delaveau, a local girl who had been frequently seen entering and exiting Petiot's home, suddenly vanished. She was known to be involved in caring for her ailing mother, and neighbors had speculated about a possible relationship between her and the doctor. When she disappeared without a trace, suspicion fell squarely on Petiot. A neighbor reported seeing him dragging a heavy trunk out to his car late one night around the time of her disappearance. He described it as large, heavy, and clearly filled with something substantial. The man had watched from his window as Petiot heaved it into the trunk of his car and drove off alone into the darkness. Police questioned Petiot, but he remained calm and offered vague explanations. There was no body, no witnesses beyond the trunk sighting, and no firm evidence tying him to her disappearance. Louise's case was eventually dismissed as that of a runaway, albeit an unusual one. But her family never accepted that conclusion, nor did the townspeople forget. Rumors began to circulate that perhaps the doctor's charm was just a mask. Whispers of his erratic behavior, strange hours, and manipulative habits began to take root. But before they could become anything more, Petiot took the offensive. He ran for mayor, and won. Once elected, Petiot used his office to enrich himself. Further, he embezzled public funds, misused city resources, and surrounded himself with loyalists. When eventually exposed, he was suspended from office and later resigned. Still, he managed to secure another public role as a district councillor, where he again stole and schemed until he was finally removed for good. But the damage had been done. Marcel Petiot had learned that with the right costume and enough confidence, he could be anyone: doctor, politician, savior, or killer. And Paris, as he would soon prove, would be his greatest stage yet. By 1940, the Third Reich had swallowed France in a matter of weeks. German troops marched through Parisian streets with mechanical precision, and life under occupation became an oppressive routine of fear, suspicion, and silent resistance. For the city's citizens, everything had changed. Food was scarce, freedom was rationed, and death was an ever-present threat. Yet amid this darkness, some individuals saw opportunity rather than despair. Marcel Petiot was one of them. While his fellow Parisians watched their freedoms dissolve under the Nazi boot, Petiot looked out over the crumbling landscape and saw potential for profit. For him, the war was not a tragedy. It was a business model. He resumed his work as a doctor in Paris, quickly re-establishing himself by exploiting the chaos. Under the guise of legitimate medical practice, he began forging documents for Jewish families and resistance fighters, false medical exemptions, fake IDs, and prescriptions for those trying to avoid Nazi labor conscription. For the desperate, Petiot was a godsend. He understood the bureaucracy and how to bend it. He could write a certificate declaring someone too sick to work, too mentally ill to be deported, or too vital to be detained. But he never did anything for free. Everything had a price, and many paid dearly, first with francs and later with their lives. In July 1942, he was officially convicted for overprescribing narcotics, a familiar charge that had followed him from the countryside to the capital. Several addicts who had been prepared to testify against him vanished without explanation before the trial. With no witnesses, Petiot was fined, but not imprisoned. He walked away unscathed once again, cloaked in the legal ambiguity that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Still, he maintained the illusion of the respectable physician, even boasting in private circles that he was developing chemical weapons to use against the Germans. An absurd claim, but one that fed into his growing legend among those who didn't know better. He also began telling people that he had joined the French resistance, that he was smuggling Jews out of occupied France, and that he had contacts in high places. He spoke of meetings with Allied commanders, of coordinating with Spanish anti-fascist groups, of laying traps for Nazi patrols. None of these claims were true. But in a city suffocated by fear and uncertainty, people clung to hopeful stories, and Petiot's fantasy world provided exactly that. In truth, he was constructing a private empire of fraud, built on the backs of the hunted and the hopeless. It was during this time that he created what would become his most infamous venture, an escape network he dubbed Flytox. To the casual observer, Flytox sounded innocuous. After all, it was the name of a common household pesticide. But in Petiot's twisted interpretation, it became a symbol of eradication, and those who entered the program would soon learn that the only place they were going was to their death. He recruited 3 accomplices, Raoul Fourier, Edmond Pintard, and René Gustave Nézondet. Together they targeted individuals desperate to flee Nazi-occupied France, Jews, resistance fighters, criminals, or anyone with a reason to vanish. Flytox was sold as a sophisticated smuggling operation with routes to Argentina, Portugal, or even Great Britain. Clients were told they would be inoculated before departure, provided documents, and escorted safely to a neutral country. In reality, the entire operation was a deadly ruse. Petiot wasn't saving anyone. He was eliminating them, swiftly, coldly, and without remorse. Those who stepped into his home believed they were stepping toward freedom, but in truth, they were walking straight into a carefully designed death trap, one that was becoming increasingly efficient and increasingly invisible. And in a city already drowning in disappearances, no one noticed. By the time Marcel Petiot's fake escape network was fully operational, it had become a well-oiled machine of deception and death. Operating out of his secondary residence at 21 Rue Le Sueur, a quiet townhouse tucked away in an affluent Parisian district, Petiot transformed the building into a gateway to hell. The house served as the supposed departure point for his smuggling operation, what he called Flytox. To those desperate to escape Nazi persecution, it was a lifeline. To Petiot, it was a hunting ground. The name Flytox, borrowed from a common French pesticide used to kill flies, was more than just a code name. Whether intentionally symbolic or just darkly ironic, it came to represent the extermination of those he had promised to save. Flytox operated under the guise of legitimacy. Petiot's accomplices, Fourier, Pintard and Nazonde were responsible for identifying potential clients. They roamed Paris and its outskirts, often infiltrating refugee communities and resistance cells, quietly spreading word about a man who could guarantee safe passage out of France. The target demographic was clear: people with something to fear and something to lose. Jewish families, Allied sympathizers, deserters, underground fighters, even petty criminals, all of them wanted out, and all of them were willing to pay for the illusion of escape. Petiot's fees were exorbitant, typically 25,000 francs per person, often more for entire families. Many liquidated all their possessions or borrowed from friends and relatives to meet the price. When a client agreed to the terms, they were brought to 21 Rue Le Sueur. There, Petiot greeted them personally, often with warmth and the air of a seasoned professional. The house looked ordinary, clean, quiet, and organized. Petiot played his part well. He would go over travel documents, discuss the logistics of the escape, and reassure his clients that they were just one step away from freedom. Then came the final step: inoculations. He claimed that international travel required vaccinations to prevent the spread of disease. Sometimes it was yellow fever, sometimes typhus or cholera, whatever fit the narrative. Clients were told they must be injected to proceed. They rarely questioned it. After all, he was a doctor. What he injected into their veins was not medicine. It was cyanide. The deaths were swift. Victims often collapsed within seconds or minutes. Some convulsed violently. Others fell into unconsciousness and never woke up. Once dead, Petiot began the next phase of his operation, stripping the bodies of all valuables, collecting jewelry, cash, documents, and even clothing. He stored the possessions for later resale or laundering. Then came disposal. In the early days, Petiot used the Seine River to discard the corpses, often dismembered to fit into suitcases or bags. But this method drew risk. Transporting bodies through Paris, even under the cover of night, was dangerous. Eventually, Petiot developed more elaborate techniques. He dug a pit in his garage, filling it with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. When that became insufficient, he began burning the bodies in a coal stove located in the basement. The smell of burning flesh would later become the catalyst for his downfall, but for months, he continued the routine uninterrupted. The scale of the killing is still difficult to measure. When authorities finally uncovered his operations, the remains of dozens of victims were found, some incinerated, others rotting in lime pits. Later, he would claim that he had killed 63 people. The true number may be higher. Through all of this, Petiot maintained his mask of benevolence. He continued to work as a doctor in other parts of the city, still claiming ties to the resistance, still speaking about the importance of fighting the Nazi regime. His lies were woven so deeply into the fabric of occupied Paris that even some resistance members believed him. While the city lived in fear of German patrols and secret police, the real monster lived quietly among them, hidden behind a polished smile, a white coat, and a false promise of salvation. As Operation Flytox continued to claim victims, the scale and brutality of Marcel Petiot's killings escalated to almost industrial levels. With his deception perfected and his reputation largely unquestioned, Petiot no longer needed to move cautiously. He killed with alarming frequency, and his methods evolved with experience. Once satisfied with simply disposing of bodies in the Seine under the cover of night, he began embracing more permanent, efficient solutions, turning his home into a factory of murder and erasure. The townhouse at 21 Rue Le Sueur no longer functioned as a temporary stopover. It became a slaughterhouse, equipped for murder, body disposal, and asset extraction. Inside the home, each room served a purpose. The reception area was where victims were welcomed, reassured, and financially processed. After payment, they were escorted to the basement, where Petiot administered the supposed inoculations. Once the victims collapsed, Petiot began his ritual. He searched their bodies for valuables: gold rings, watches, identification papers, foreign currency, or anything of monetary worth. Items were collected, cataloged in his own manner, and stashed for later use. Families were often wiped out in a single evening. Their banknotes and heirlooms vanished with them. Even their clothing was sometimes cleaned and repurposed. Petiot didn't just kill for survival, he killed for wealth, for control, and seemingly, for satisfaction. Body disposal became more methodical and grotesque with time. Early attempts to throw corpses into the Seine had posed too great a risk. Too many eyes, too many questions. Petiot adapted. He dug a lime pit in his garage, filling it with corrosive chemicals that could reduce a human body to pulp in a matter of days. But even this had its limits. The pit eventually filled, and the smell could not be fully masked. So he started burning the bodies in a coal stove in his basement, an unusually large industrial-style stove that seemed excessive for a physician's needs. It was perfect for cremation. Neighbors would later recall the bitter, sickening stench that often wafted from his home, particularly in the colder months when the fire was always going. In time, Petiot added another pit in the yard. When that filled, the disposal process became increasingly careless. Remains were stored in bins, barrels, and sacks in various rooms. Bones, human fat, even scalps and hair were found scattered throughout the basement and garage. Later, forensic investigators cataloged the horror with clinical detachment. At least 33 pounds of charred bone, 10 human scalps, 11 pounds of hair and body parts stuffed in garbage bins like discarded meat. One sack contained nothing but jawbones and teeth. Another held femurs and ribs. It was no longer just killing. It was butchery. Among the most disturbing discoveries was the hidden chamber in the basement. A small, octagonal room with soundproofed walls, shackles bolted to the interior, and a peephole in the door. It was clear that not all of Petiot's victims had died instantly. Some were held prisoner, likely interrogated or tortured before they were murdered. The existence of this room removed any remaining doubt about his intent. This was not a man helping refugees. This was a sadist, a man who took pleasure in power, domination, and death, and all of it had been hidden in plain sight. Yet through all of this, Petiot continued to operate unchecked. The German occupation had created a smokescreen of confusion and fear, and within it, he thrived. Disappearances were commonplace. Families were terrified of asking too many questions. The police were either overwhelmed or reluctant to interfere, especially when Petiot claimed his victims were German collaborators or enemies of France. His lies were effective, his cover airtight. For nearly 2 years, Petiot murdered with impunity, turning 21 Rue Le Sueur into a place where hope went to die. When the horrors of 21 Rue Le Sueur were finally discovered in March 1944, the immediate question was, where was Marcel Petiot? The man responsible for dozens of brutal murders had vanished just before the authorities arrived. As police and firemen examined the scorched remains in his basement, Petiot was already miles away, watching the chaos he had left behind unfold from a safe distance. What followed was one of the most astonishing deceptions in French criminal history. A fugitive hiding in plain sight, not as a vagrant or exile, but as a self-proclaimed war hero embedded within the very resistance forces hunting him. Petiot had seen this moment coming. The thick smoke and putrid odor pouring from his basement had been reported by neighbors for days. He knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities arrived. On March 11th, he lit one final fire in his stove, packed his things, and disappeared into the fog of war. When police attempted to contact him, he assured them over the phone that he would return shortly to explain everything. He never did. Instead, he crafted a new identity, one that gave him freedom, protection, and influence. He became Captain Henri Valery of the French Forces of the Interior. Assuming a false identity wasn't new for Petiot, but this time he elevated the lie to something near genius. He infiltrated the resistance, presenting himself as a dedicated patriot hunted by the Gestapo for allegedly assassinating German soldiers and collaborators. In truth, he had never lifted a finger for the resistance. But the chaos of France's shifting power structures in 1944 worked in his favor. German forces were on the defensive, and the Allies were preparing for the liberation of France. In this unstable environment, documentation was rarely questioned if a man appeared loyal and competent. Petiot, ever the manipulator, played the part perfectly. Under the name Valery, he participated in raids, oversaw interrogations, and even gave orders to other resistance members. He became a figure of authority in the Paris region, positioned to monitor others while continuing to obscure his own past. He grew a beard to alter his appearance, adopted new habits, and only moved at night. To his fellow resistance fighters, he was a hero. To the police, he was still a ghost. Wanted, but invisible. For nearly 7 months, Petiot lived this double life, hiding not in exile but within the very movement that had vowed to purge France of traitors and monsters. The irony reached its peak when, in the summer of 1944, Petiot was tasked with helping coordinate searches for himself. The police, unaware that the man they now trusted as Captain Valéry was in fact the very butcher they were hunting, gave him access to information and freedom of movement. He did everything he could to steer the investigation away from himself, all while maintaining the image of a committed patriot. But the web of lies eventually began to unravel. His downfall began not with a betrayal, but with arrogance. He couldn't resist defending his reputation. In September 1944, a French newspaper published an exposé labeling Petiot as a murderer and a traitor. Enraged, he anonymously sent a letter to his old defense attorney, denouncing the article as slander. That letter, laced with familiar phrases and unmistakable references, tipped off the authorities that Petiot was still alive and still in Paris. A renewed manhunt was launched, this time with far more scrutiny. On October 31, 1944, Petiot's luck finally ran out. He was recognized and arrested at a Paris metro station. At the time of his arrest, he was carrying a pistol, over 30,000 francs in cash, and no fewer than 50 different sets of identification. After months of deception, reinvention, and murder, Dr. Marcel Petiot, alias Henri Valéry, was finally caught. The man who had played both monster and martyr had run out of masks. Marcel Petiot's arrest marked the end of one of the most disturbing manhunts in wartime France, but it also marked the beginning of a deeper, more chilling reckoning. When police apprehended him on October 31, 1944, at a Paris metro station, they found a man completely prepared for flight and deception. He carried a loaded pistol, 31,700 francs in cash, and no less than 50 forged identity documents. His appearance was altered, his beard thick, his manner calm. Petiot did not resist arrest. In fact, he seemed almost amused, as though the game had merely taken another turn. But this time, he wouldn't escape with lies or forged diagnoses. The evidence left behind at 21 Rue Le Sueur was undeniable, and the veil he had carefully woven over the years was rapidly unraveling. During initial interrogations, Petiot reverted to the same defense he had used many times before. He insisted that he was a patriot, a hero of the resistance, and that every body found in his home had belonged to traitors, informants, and Nazi collaborators. He claimed that the gruesome discoveries were not the remnants of victims, but trophies of justice. His story, however, quickly fell apart. Investigators uncovered no credible connections between Petiot and any official resistance group. His name did not appear in legitimate intelligence or resistance rosters, and his actions did not align with verified anti-Nazi operations. The resistance, once flattered by his false allegiance, now distanced themselves from him entirely. The investigation into the house at Rue Le Sueur revealed a macabre tableau that no patriotic narrative could explain. Forensic specialists cataloged what remained: heaps of scorched bones, 10 human scalps, dozens of pounds of human hair, and bins filled with flesh too decomposed or incinerated to be identified. Some of the victims' possessions, watches, jewelry, foreign currency, were discovered hidden in various locations, suggesting the murders were driven not by resistance ideology, but by greed. There was no sign that any of the dead had been Germans. Many were Jews, refugees, or individuals who had been attempting to escape persecution. Petiot's actions were not those of a man defending France. They were those of a predator exploiting a nation in crisis. Additional evidence came from those who had been close to him. His brother Maurice confessed to delivering quicklime to Petiot's house on multiple occasions, under suspicious circumstances. Accomplices from the Flytox operation were interrogated and admitted to luring victims to the home under false pretenses, though many claimed they never knew the fate awaiting them inside. Some said they believed Petiot was indeed helping people escape. Others confessed that over time they began to suspect the truth, but by then it was too late to withdraw. Police also reviewed prior suspicions against Petiot, including the mysterious disappearance of Louise Delavaux years earlier, and 2 individuals tied to his narcotics charges who had vanished without a trace. In the aftermath of his arrest, it became clear that Petiot's crimes extended well beyond the war years. His entire adult life had been one long exercise in manipulation, cruelty, and self-preservation at the expense of others. Public fascination with the case grew rapidly. Newspapers referred to him as Dr. Satan, the Butcher of Paris, and the Monster in the White Coat. France, exhausted by war, was now united in revulsion. What made Petiot's case so horrifying wasn't just the number of dead or the gruesomeness of the crimes. It was the betrayal of trust. He had killed people who believed he was their last hope. He had worn the uniform of compassion, cloaked himself in patriotism, and murdered in the silence of their faith in him. With mounting evidence, national outrage, and no credible defense left, the fate of Marcel Petiot was sealed. All that remained now was his day in court, a stage he would enter characteristically with arrogance, denial, and one final performance. Marcel Petiot's trial began on March 19, 1946, nearly 2 years after the grisly discovery at 21 Rue Le Sueur had shocked Paris and the world. The courtroom was filled with journalists, grieving families, and curious spectators who came not only to seek justice, but to witness the final act of one of France's most infamous murderers. The prosecution charged Petiot with 27 counts of murder, each one linked to a victim whose remains had been recovered from his home. But the case wasn't only about proving guilt. It was about piercing the twisted psyche of a man who had fooled an entire nation during its darkest hour. From the start, Petiot approached the proceedings with the same arrogance and theatricality that had defined his life. Represented by his former defense attorney, René Fleuriot, Petiot maintained that he was not a murderer, but a patriot. He claimed that every person who had died at Rue Le Sueur had been an enemy of France, a Gestapo informant, a traitor, or a criminal. He even argued that some of the missing individuals were alive and well, living abroad thanks to his heroic efforts. When questioned about the possessions of his victims found in his home, he suggested they had left them behind during their escape. When asked why the victims had been dismembered and incinerated, he leaned into absurdity, claiming he had stumbled upon the bodies and burned them to protect his resistance network. His testimony often descended into grotesque spectacle. He mocked the prosecution, argued with the judge, and made wild claims about developing secret weapons for the Allies. He even admitted to killing 19 of the victims, but insisted it had been part of his mission to cleanse France of Nazi collaborators. To the jurors, many of whom had lived through the occupation, these excuses rang hollow. Behind closed doors, they referred to him as a demon, a soulless butcher. Petiot's theatrical defense was not a revelation of innocence. It was a confirmation of madness and malevolence. Witness after witness took the stand. Family members who had lost loved ones, experts who detailed the medical precision of the killings, forensic analysts who testified about the horrific scenes. In the basement and garage, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. While Petiot's defense tried to stir doubt by framing him as a misunderstood resistance fighter, no credible links to actual resistance activity were ever found. His supposed patriotism was exposed as self-serving fiction. The truth was simple and devastating. Marcel Petiot had exploited war, fear, and desperation to build a personal empire of death. On May 25, 1946, justice was delivered. Petiot was convicted of 26 counts of murder and sentenced to death by guillotine. At dawn, he was led to the execution chamber. He declined the customary glass of rum but accepted a cigarette. Just before he was strapped down, he looked at the witnesses with a smile and offered his final words. "Gentlemen, I have one last piece of advice. Look away. This won't be pretty. I want you to keep a good memory of me." The blade fell. At 5:05 a.m., the Butcher of Paris was no more. But the horror he unleashed left a scar on history, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a uniform or march under a flag. Sometimes it wears a white coat, smiles gently, and offers to help. You enjoyed this deep dive into one of the darkest chapters of wartime France? What are your thoughts on Petiot? Madman, mastermind, or both? Drop your opinions in the comments. Let's discuss. If you're fascinated by true crime, wartime secrets, or stories that defy belief, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are many more chilling stories on the way, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Your curiosity deserves answers. Your support keeps them coming. Subscribe now.